practices and the way these analyses are used to inform spatial planning to prioritize certain land uses in rangelands. These practices have potential to extend injustices in different contexts where pastoralism is a widespread, important livelihood that many marginalized groups rely on. And so this is work in progress where I'm trying to build a generalizable framing that can be applied across different rangeland contexts. And just as a quick beginning note, when I say pastoralism, which I'll say a lot through this talk, I'm using it as a placeholder for livestock husbandry strategies that enable people to gain benefits from variable dryland and montane environments, primarily through mobility. But this should actually be thought of as pastoralisms, or a diversity of kinds of mobile livestock keeping, where there's a spectrum of complex forms of social organization around shared labor, land, knowledge, and property. And there are distinct relationships between herders and livestock, where herders carefully guide animals to maximize their health. And so I don't want to essentialize pastoralism, but at the same time it tends to be quite distinct from commercial livestock keeping and production and ranching in particular. And so in ways that are important, especially when we talk about global environmental change. Sorry. Okay, so in recent decades, dryland rangelands have become frontiers for extractive industry, green energy production, wildlife conservation, and soil carbon sequestration projects in most recent years. And soil carbon projects in particular have been expanding in the wake of 30 by 30, where international development organizations, philanthropic organizations, international conservation NGOs, and the private sector have increasingly emphasized the overlaps of wildlife and carbon. And this has worked together with new protocols approved by verification agencies that enable accounting of soil carbon. And there's been a push to create new values for conservancies in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which revealed instability in incomes through tourism. And so various agendas are synergizing to forward interrelated interventions to transform both land configuration and livestock sectors in Tanzania and Kenya. And so pastoralists have tended to have weak recognition of their land rights as well as their human rights, including many indigenous peoples in Kenya and Tanzania that are not recognized as indigenous. And there have been ongoing evictions of Maasai people in Tanzania in particular, which I'm sure you've all heard about. So there are strong colonial and centralized state legacies that continue to shape assumptions about land use, but also in the political imagination. Their land has often been seen as wastelands or empty lands, where interventions can be applied with few political or economic trade-offs. And so there's an increasing risk of interventions that are not only ecologically inappropriate, but to create potentials to extend distributive injustices around land and benefits from land, that foster procedural injustices that bypass pastoralist norms of decision-making, and also deepen recognition injustices related to pastoralist ways of knowing and being. And so I'm drawing on a framework provided by Rose Pritchard and colleagues to understand the sources of uncertainty and layers in analysis practices, but I'm also considering the social processes and consequences of geospatial analyses, where different actors are able to apply these data and practices to produce knowledge about socio-ecological systems that is then used to prioritize specific types of interventions in land use. And so when we look at the global scale, there are well-known problems with the data used to characterize pastoral rangelands. So existing data do not represent mobility and flexible land access, where pastoralist systems have fluid boundaries and overlaps between different social groups. And similarly, most layers that include data on livestock densities are not only highly inaccurate, but tend to reinforce a universal understanding where livestock are considered equivalent to intensive commercial livestock or ranching. And long-term remotely sensed data sets, thank you, that offer widespread spatial coverage are not able to distinguish between woody and herbaceous vegetation in rangelands, as well as other types of heterogeneity. And so these often mischaracterize important changes in these environments. And so further, rangelands are also inherently variable ecosystems that are shaped by complex dynamics of fire, herbivory, and climate. So this leads to compounds this misunderstanding. And saliently, the most commonly used analysis methods do not appropriately account for spatiotemporal variability in climate. And alternative methods that do often show that those analyses are inappropriate and that conclude degradation when there actually isn't any. And even with recent advances in remote sensing methodologies and spatial statistics, these ecosystems remain extremely challenging to characterize, measure, and predict. But importantly, there's a troubling pattern where despite high uncertainty, rangelands are often generalized about at the global scale as degraded and in need of intervention, repeating a long history of knowledge produced about these systems that we can trace to colonial lineages of thinking about stability. And there are important interrelationships between ways of imagining and prioritizing rangelands at global and national scales. And so relationships with local communities are extremely important to consider for understanding the practice and consequences of geospatial analysis at local scales. And in both Kenya and Tanzania, there's a direct link between biophysical science and policy, where wildlife conservation and carbon projects are high priorities at the national level, but both states increasingly focus on wildlife connectivity and pastoral lands outside of national parks as well. And there are important national differences in how international NGOs interact with and have come to step into the role of the state. So in Kenya, in the wake of decentralization reforms, there's been increasing delegation of authority over wildlife conservation and land management from the state to international NGOs, who are also highly involved in prioritization science and often collaborate with government agencies. There are also important contrasts in land rights regimes with elite ownership of large swaths of land, of private land in Kenya, and also a troubled community land policy in Kenya, which contrasts with the centralized state control of both protected areas and community lands in Tanzania. And so land regimes are closely related to the structure of authorities, the role of international NGOs, and the shape of who is able to, and these shape who is able to make decisions on behalf of communities and policy. And so in the case of Kenya, wildlife conservation NGOs have worked closely with local representatives and pastoral elites to establish projects in coordination with the Kenya Wildlife Service and the county level governments. However, these practices have been highly contested as they've tended to enclose key resources such as watering sites and seasonally important forage sites. And these practices also create new benefit streams from ecotourism that tend to be concentrated in the hands of the state, ecotourism operators, and pastoralist elites. And so non-state actors have increasingly used geospatial analysis focused on wildlife movements, and the results of those analyses have been used to delineate and create spatial representations of wildlife corridors, especially for elephants and other threatened species that are highly mobile. And for example, this output on the left that draws on land cover data, wildlife movement data, and land use data to show least cost corridors across Tanzania as a whole, which has then been refined in collaboration with the Tanzanian government on the right to create a national prioritization plan. Importantly, though, these analyses acknowledge spatiotemporal variability, but only from the wildlife's perspective, and support reconfiguring land to create a secure configuration that is navigable to wildlife, but don't account for the mobility of pastoralists. And this has been used to extend sedentarization policies and long histories of injustices and exclusions from protected areas and other trends in the region that work against pastoralist practices of maximizing animal health in response to variability. And so these practices also center these conservation activities to show how various interventions are safeguarding biodiversity. But at the same time, this erases pastoralist long-standing ways of being together with land and wildlife, and the high concentrations of mammalian biodiversity that are on pastoral lands. Thanks. And pastoral practices, how they've often sustained habitat for wildlife, especially diverse communities of mammalian grazers. Sorry about that. So representations of wildlife corridors based primarily on tracking of elephant movements in northern Kenya have been strategically used to justify widespread expansion of so-called community conservancies. But importantly, these also help to secure property relations for large private ranches that were originally established by European settlers in Kenya. And then just skipping ahead. And then similarly, in southern Kenya, mobility patterns of species like elephants and wildebeest have been mapped by NGOs and have a strong influence on land policy at the county and local level. And in one example from a place that I've worked a lot around Amboseli National Park, these representations have been simplified, or I'm sorry, the mobility tracks of these different species have been simplified into these representations that were then heavily influential in policy formation. And they were used to bypass pastoralist community decision-making processes and also sidestepped Kenyan community land reform laws to secure new conservancies that were delineated as corridors. And this cemented these secure conservancies and corridors into place based on those delineated corridors that were based on the data. And so, concerningly, now carbon projects, soil carbon projects are building on these representations in the landscapes, but also working around this new land use zoning throughout Kenya and Tanzania. But these projects do not account for the importance of gradients in topography, climate, and soil fertility, all of which have known relations with soil carbon. In the assessment practices they report do not apply adequate sampling, spatial analysis, or modeling practices that could appropriately account for this heterogeneity and the dynamics of these systems, which raises questions about how these projects are demonstrated additionality and how that can be attributed to new grazing management regimes that are being introduced as part of these carbon projects. And so there's also a surprising regularity among projects where they claim widespread degradation of pastoral rangelands, despite no robust empirical evidence of decline in productivity that's independent from rainfall. However, claiming widespread degradation with a new management system imposed also potentially creates potential for these projects to attribute changes to the impacts to grazing management. And further, these interventions appear to be building on sedentarization policies and a long history of top-down attempts to fragment pastoral socio-ecological systems and also intervene in livestock management. And they also obscure historical practices of pastoralists, the way that they've managed their land, and their current practices. So just quickly in closing, I'm working towards a synthetic way of thinking about the sources of uncertainty in the data layers and analysis practices, and whether or not these uncertainties are made transparent. And engaging with the geospatial models is potentially useful, but also inherently political, and used in ways that tend to exclude pastoralist perspectives. So closely related is a need to understand the epistemic communities who are doing geospatial analysis, and how the outputs of spatial analysis then are rendered into simplified representations. And so there's a need to understand who uses these outputs, what types of interventions they are used to advocate for, and what the underlying values that motivate those uses are. To understand the different assumptions, values, and norms at different stages that can cut down or create opportunities for more justice-centered analytical practices and conservation practices. But this also requires a reframing to center pastoralists as experts in navigating variability and uncertainty and managing important production systems, but also as experts in understanding changes in landscapes, people, livestock, and wildlife. And collaborative responses are really what needs to be centered to forward more socially just and environmentally appropriate conservation. Hey, thanks. Hey, thanks so much.
Okay, great. Next we have Dr. Carlos Alberto Lopez Arcadia from UNAM, who's going to be presenting on creative methods and the use of board games in coffee agroecosystems. Here you go.
Gracias.
Yeah.
Bueno, hola, buenas tardes. Yo soy, maestro, Carlos Alberto López Arcadia. Les voy a presentar la plática titulada Transformation of Coffee Landscapes, Co-Production of Pathways for Sustainability through Participatory Serious Board Games. Este trabajo fue realizado con Marta Bonilla Moeno, Tlacarel Rivera Núñez y muchas otras personas que estuvieron apoyándonos en el camino. Y para allá. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about the importance of coffee landscapes in the mountainous tropical regions of Mexico and Central America. Here, coffee is grown under the shade of trees, mainly by smallholders, and the coffee plots are interspersed with forests and other crops, commercial and subsistence crops. So this constitutes an agroecological matrix of great ecological, social, economic and cultural importance that serves to maintain the livelihoods of thousands of families involved in this crop. However, due to the cumulative effects of social environmental crises, the persistence of these landscapes has been compromised. One of these crises is the coffee leaf rust outbreak that took place in 2012-2013 in the region. And this crisis was met with a response of the government, mainly focused on replacing traditional coffee varieties that were infected with disease with hybrid-resistant ones. But this was accompanied with a reduction of tree cover that in the process simplifies the farms and the landscape altogether. So with this in mind, from 2020 to 2022, we studied how the relational environment of smallholders mediated the impact of the coffee leaf rust on their management practices and the effect in the configuration of the coffee landscape in central Veracruz. So we wanted to see how the relationships established with certain actors had an influence on the response that they had facing this crisis. We did this through a combination of remote sensing and social network analysis. And we found that there was an increase in deforestation after the outbreak, mainly associated with the intensification of management of the coffee plots. There were less trees in these plots. And, or to the transition to other commercial crops mainly, although in some indigenous regions, there was also a transition to subsistence crops such as la milpa. However, we found that there was a differentiated response according to the relations established. So we found that the smallholders that work independently or more isolated showed a tendency to diminish the tree cover of their farms, and they were associated mainly with agribusiness. No? We were with conventional markets that are dominated by agribusiness. And on the other hand, the organized smallholders showed a tendency to have little to no change in tree cover in their farms, and they were more organized and sold mainly to alternative markets. So we had all these insights of this research, but we wanted not just to talk about them in these terms, but also to return to some of the communities and reflect upon these findings. So for this, we thought that a useful tool, an adequate tool to do so, was to design a game, a socio-ecological board game, because they are representations of social ecological systems that allow us to elucidate the dynamics of the system, to explore scenarios of transformation, and to propose visions of the future through collective reflection. And they serve also as analytic tools for participatory research. They are implemented, in workshops, and there's a collective reflection that can foster social learning. And we designed this game called Cafés, Coffee Agroecosystems Fostering Environmental Sustainability. And we did this, well, with these ethical considerations in mind of returning the information. With ethical considerations in mind, like to return the information, but also to well, have a dialogue about these results with the people that kindly gave us their knowledge, their experiences, and their time. We really just systematized what they already knew. No? So we wanted to discuss and to reflect around this systematization, these results, and we wanted to vinculate somehow the knowledge to the practice. And with this game, we wanted to reflect about the local challenges of the sector and to identify possible pathways to livable and desirable land futures in their own terms. And we analyze this through the Pathways to Transformation framework that poses certain points of intervention, leverages, and some ways to implement these interventions, levers. So, the implementation of the workshops. From February to April of this year, we held participatory workshops in 3 locations in Veracruz, an eastern state in Mexico, with 65 participants from 32 different communities. The workshops had like 4 main stages. First, we gave an introduction of the objectives of the game and a little summary of the research, but just a summary, because if not, we will give spoilers of the dynamics of the system. Then we asked for the consent, had a game session, and afterwards a collective reflection guided by this framework. And what we found was this. 6 envisioned futures or visions of the sector that are overlapping between each other, and sometimes they are complementary, sometimes they are like conflicted between each other, and they are these ones, like a future of food sovereignty, a future of autonomy, a future thinking about the future generations, strengthening a partnership with government, a strengthened partnership with government, rural enterprises, and dignified life, or vida digna. Each of these like petals is made up of certain challenges that are to be overcome by certain actions, that are to be like enactions by certain actors. When analyzing these actors, challenges, we found that mainly they had to do with inequalities, the challenges. These inequalities were mainly the influence of the agribusiness in the region and the low profitability of coffee that are interlinked, right? Because agribusiness has like a hold on this sector. So they are inequalities of contextual, distributive, and also procedural nature. On the other hand, the actions are mainly focused on adaptive decision making and are represented mainly by the cooperation between producers, as this will mean the self-organization of agents of change. They told us about like we have to cooperate in order to face this situation. And also a livelihood diversification, that this will mean a redundancy for the uncertainty involved in this socio-ecological system. And well, and for the sake of brevity, I'm going to talk about only 2 of these like futures, because there's not so much time. And I'm going to talk about these ones, dignified life and rural enterprises, that somehow are related with all the other ones. So. This one, rural enterprises, or as we called it, profitability and entrepreneurship. Well, this is the graph there is a representation of the challenges, actions, and actors involved, and it's like all the interactions that are like in this vision. And this, in summary, this vision seeks to increase coffee profitability and to consolidate the rural entrepreneurship. And this is to be done by the cooperation between smallholders, an increasing yield, and an increasing the quality of coffee. And it addresses mainly inequalities, telecouplings, and visions of a good life. And, well, the levers are adaptive decision-making, environmental law and implementation, and the key actors are government, cooperatives, and smallholders. So this vision is mainly focused, let's say, on the productive side of the sector, right? Like to make it profitable. On the other hand, we have this one, this other one that dignified life, or as they called vida digna, that is like complementary also to the other one. And in this one, there's a focus on the productive side of coffee, but also on the social reproduction aspects of this practice. So here they seek to achieve well-being through coffee landscapes, to foster cooperations, to build fair markets, and themselves define the relevance of the programs and the coffee prices. They seek here a livelihood diversification, work with younger generations, and the government here regulates the markets and facilitates programs for education, agroecological diversification, while all the other things are done by the cooperatives and the smallholders themselves. And the leverages are mainly the same. So, well, I'm just presenting these two. And, okay. Well, and the conclusions. Well, we thought that it is important to explore diverse methodologies to communicate our results, or the results of scientific research. And we found that, well, this game at least, was an appropriate tool that could be adapted in other contexts and implemented in other contexts. And these workshops created spaces of reflection and of dialogue that we found that it represented the challenges, livelihoods, and opportunities of the sector somehow correctly. And it helped to envision these pathways. So we think that it is important to accompany, well, the smallholders in the production of like alternatives in their own terms. And well, we found these overlapping visions, and we think that the insights derived from this work are to be addressed if we want to transform the sector, but accordingly to the views of the people that are there working day to day in the field, and not just like impose them top down from our own insights or like hunches. So that's all, and we want, well, I and many other people want to acknowledge all these people that helped us with the design, with the piloting of the game, with certain videos. Here is a QR code that you can scan. There's a video of the project if you want to see a little bit more. Well, that's all. Thank you very much.
That was great, Carlos. Thanks so much. You did great. Great. And next we have Dr. Courtney Schultz from Colorado State, who's going to be talking about decolonizing fire management in the American West.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm a professor at Colorado State University. I work on public land policy, which is also native land policy in the U.S. And I'm talking today about a project we have working on fire management, particularly post-fire recovery priorities and challenges for Native nations and pueblos in the U.S. West. And I have a large team, but also just put on here the name of my postdoctoral researcher and graduate student, Greg Russell and Caitlin Cruz, who helped me put this together today. So our research objectives for this project, funded by the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, were to identify recovery priorities and then also management options for tribes on their ancestral homelands. And this was after large fires. So if you're familiar with the U.S. West, we're having a lot of more severe and larger fires that are really affecting ecosystems and communities in really intense ways. And then we wanted to look at the governance barriers and opportunities to better address post-fire recovery needs for tribes. And part of what my group does is then put together policy briefings in partnership with our research communities to take to legislators to try to improve policy. So I'm mostly going to focus on our methodology today. We have a participatory case study methodology. I wouldn't say it's fully co-produced because we didn't design the research at the outset together, but we've designed our research approach and materials in collaboration with our partners, and we have a tribal advisory council as well. And we're using semi-structured interviews in the sense that we have interview questions that we want to go through, but we also explain to every community that we work with that they can prioritize whatever they want in the conversation. So we tell them that we're generally here to talk about, say, this fire and what your priorities are, but then if our interviewees really want to talk about Indigenous fire stewardship according to their traditions or some of their governance priorities more generally, we really let our interviewees take that where they want to. So it's actually a pretty unstructured process, and then we give a lot of editorial authority to our participants and tribal leaders. So we tend to take the lead on writing papers based on these findings, but we often let people, well, we always let people check all of their quotes, decide if they want to have attribution for any quotes, co-write the histories, and then check all of our papers together with every person we interviewed and also with tribal leadership. The main reason we're leading on the paper writing but co-authoring with our Native partners is really more like about capacity than anything, and most of our Native partners want us to take the lead on that. We have 3 case studies we're completing for this project. The Washoe tribe in Nevada and California, they've had some really large fires. This is around the Lake Tahoe area. The Karuk tribe in Northern California, they've had some incredibly enormous fires in that area and continue to. And then the Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico that's also faced a number of large fires. And I'm going to just tell you a little bit about methodologically how we did the research and then some of the key findings from each case. So for the Washoe tribe, their environmental director from their Department of Natural Resources was on our advisory board. And then we worked with her to determine whether they were interested in participating in the research, whether it would advance their goals as well. And they thought yes, and then took a proposal with us there with them to tribal council and agreed to work with us. And so then that person kind of serves as a portal to interviewees that they think are interested in the research. But a lot of times this person who's kind of our main contact with the particular tribe is also protecting like people from being bothered too much by us. So for example, they're often saying like, no, we don't want you to contact our tribal chairman about this, for example, just because of capacity and relevance. So in this case, we interviewed tribal elders, leaders, and employees. Our article right now is being co-written and reviewed by that environmental director, their cultural resource and language director, all of our participants, and then probably tribal council. And then she's presenting that work in partnership with us at an upcoming Southwest Fire Ecology meeting that'll be in Santa Fe. I think one of the things that's been really interesting about this work is that every tribe has very different histories in terms of how their land was divided, what kinds of treaty rights and unceded rights they have or that are important to them. For the Washoe tribe, pinon pines are incredibly important to the tribe, but the history for that tribe is that there's no federal land reservation for the Washoe, and most of the land that's in pinon pine, well, there's some reservation, but most of the land that's in the pinon pine area is in allotments, so like these individually held, privatized allotments that are managed by a federal agency on behalf of individuals. It's just led to a lot of problems actually coordinating across the ecosystem or doing things across ownerships. And then we also have some funding programs that have to be spent after a fire in a certain number of years. And so coordinating with multiple agencies and multiple land ownerships means that they're not actually able to address some of their concerns on those lands in a timely way because the timing of the funding expires after a couple years. This is a big problem in post-fire policy, which is probably like almost like a satire of how bad policy can be in general in the US, but it's particularly bad for tribes when you have to coordinate across these ownerships. So they're seeing a lot of invasive species and unable to implement plans on those lands. And in addition, the Forest Service that manages those lands has never created a management plan for pinon pines because it's not a priority for the US Forest Service. So that all told means that the Washoe community is seeing a huge decline in this incredibly important cultural and food resource and hasn't even been able to hold their pine nut ceremony for the last several years. One of the things that I think has surfaced from our work is that we're able to elucidate a number of recommendations that are coming from this in terms of very specific policy changes that could make a difference. Oh gosh, you didn't have that whole slide? Let's see. Did you get to see any of this? It was so good. Sorry. Okay. All right. So Let me talk a little bit about the Karuk tribe. So the Karuk tribe is really an innovator and leader when it comes to research agreements with outside researchers. They have a process called the Practicing Pikyav process. Pikyav is like their world renewal ceremony and ethic. And they set up you can go to their website and look at their Practicing Pikyav agreement, and it explains how they're going to govern research with outside researchers. It's a big priority for their natural resources department to have outside researchers come in and help to elevate their voice and their policy priorities. But they have very strong data sovereignty requirements and recommendations. So for example, when I was privileged enough to have an agreement with them to do research, they created a research council or kind of community group for me with another outside researcher who could advise me, a community member and liaison, and then also someone from their Department of Natural Resources. They create kind of like a research board for you to work with. In this case, their plants division coordinator serves on our advisory board. We have a research agreement that has very specific details on our research protocol, on our ethics, and then on our data sovereignty procedures. So we're archiving all of our data with the tribe, which of course took some work with our IRB process. But I think it's really important for the tribe to have all of those voices and recordings that they're holding themselves. In this case, we're doing interviews again with elders, leaders, and employees, and people have such different things that they want to talk about. Elders are telling much longer stories about what's going on in their fire management history. Whereas employees are telling us more specifically about challenges they're having with federal agencies. So this has been a really interesting case study. We're going to present findings again at that same fire ecology symposium together. And then we also have presented in the community a couple times, and we'll do that again. So we've needed a lot of time to just travel and be in the community for data collection and presentation. The Karuk tribe has a huge ancestral territory, and all of it is unrecognized, and so it is all under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Forest Service. The only lands that they have that are considered trust lands are lands that they have bought and then put through this very cumbersome fee-to-trust program. The Forest Service prioritized large-scale commercial timber planting, what they call site conversion, where they take a land and convert it from an oak hardwood landscape to a conifer landscape, and then it has burned multiple times before those trees actually come to a maturity to be able to be harvested, which is interesting. I asked why the Forest Service keeps doing this, and people said that people just aren't on the landscape long enough to even see the results of their work, whereas the tribe, of course, is. It's heightened fire risk to a huge extent, and then cultural burning is not recognized as a right of the tribe, even though technically by law, in the U.S., it is an unceded right in their treaty, they don't have a treaty, so they actually have the right to do cultural burning technically, but it's just not recognized. So they're working on that. I traveled to Washington, D.C. with the Karuk tribe to talk about co-management authorities with agencies and with Congress, and this is, I think, a really important movement right now going on forest lands and other public lands. So some of the things they're doing are really trying to advance their cultural burning. They're getting some improvements with the Forest Service district that's downriver, and then also promoting hardwood species through coppicing, and they're doing other things to support their basketry materials as well. So one more case, on the case of the Santa Clara Pueblo, we got permission through their forestry director to work with their Pueblo governor, and we've done a couple field trips with them, interviews with the director and employees. Like all our projects, we coded and analyzed that data. Our graduate student and our main contact there have been presenting together. There was just an Arizona Tribal Climate Forestry Summit that they went to, and again, they'll be presenting at that conference in Santa Fe. In this case, their canyon above Santa Clara Pueblo has experienced several major fires and then post-fire flooding, which has been really extreme in that area, partly because of the monsoon pattern. So this tribe is using a lot of interesting policies to get funding to actually do work on Forest Service lands that are in their ancestral territory. So a lot of what we're learning about in this case is a complex interagency recovery effort, what it takes to navigate that. A lot of times the bureaucratic requirements exceed their capacity. But what they're working on is a lot of natural restoration techniques that are a big priority to them. We've also learned that accessing federal funding that's supposed to be available really requires willing federal partners, or it's just not feasible to actually get it. So just a couple of things about the flexible methodology. I think even though this has made it a little bit challenging to explain to journals what we're doing sometimes and communicate across cases, and also have small data sets where we didn't have total control over the sampling, that's all been a challenge. But I think having these diverse backgrounds and histories and the demands on tribes, especially with like new legislation that's putting out so much funding and emphasis on tribes in the US, it just makes a more structured approach unrealistic and I think kind of inappropriate for this work. Our access to interviewees differs by tribe, and so do their histories and priorities and challenges. A few other things I'll mention is that this process certainly takes longer, so getting the research agreements to actually start our data collection after our funding came through took over a year with all of the tribes. So explaining that to funding agencies and figuring out how we can create better funding for this and structures for it, I think is really critical. A lot of our partners have significant capacity limitations. We have long wait times for review, and the delays make it harder to meet our grant commitments on time. And I think also for like my postdoctoral researcher, these timelines kind of stall his career advancement. He's totally committed to it, but it's just something we recognize. I'll also note for some of my colleagues at CSU, this is a real challenge as they go through tenure and promotion processes, like recognizing that this work takes so much more time. So I think just having a group of us that are, communicating that is really valuable. But of course, it's worth it. I think it's what supports the responsible transition of transmission of Indigenous knowledges, promotion of priorities, and allowing Indigenous people to be communicating those things directly. It certainly supports our shared understanding, respects data sovereignty, and it's a big learning area for me, but I think a really critical importance in this work. And it allows our tribal partners to emphasize what they think is important in our work. Thanks. I just want to say thanks to our funding agency and, of course, everyone we're working with and all of you for inviting me and being here today. Sorry. I was like advancing here so I could see it and I kept forgetting. Yeah, okay. That was great.
Okay, and our last presenter today is Irene Ramos, who's a PhD candidate at UNAM, and she'll be presenting on the co-production in data-centric projects in agrobiodiversity conservation in Mexico.
Hi, everyone. So I am sitting because I had a little headache earlier, so I'm comfortable right now sitting. So my name is Irene Ramos. Aside from a PhD student, I also will be talking about my role as a data manager, and I also work as an open science trainer, and all of these hats are in some way related to my talk today. So, siguiente, por favor. And I specifically chose this session to feel free to talk about this big word, epistemologies. It's a word that I often avoid in my work because my colleagues are perhaps not familiar with it, and I myself don't have a background in philosophy or science or anything related. And yet, questions about knowledge production and about knowledge legitimacy are at the core of my concerns about what it means to do kind of co-production in data-centric projects. So what I want to share today are some insights and some ideas about this intersection between data epistemologies and land epistemologies. And I will illustrate this experience with my work as a data manager, developing an information system for agrobiodiversity that was launched last year and that is currently in use at the national level here in Mexico. Siguiente. To give you a little bit of context, the Agrobiodiversity Information System, or CIAGRO in short, was a project that was developed by CONABIO. CONABIO is a governmental commission within the Ministry of the Environment And this project was funded by the Global Environment Facility with FAO as the implementation agency. CIAGRO is only one of the outputs of a bigger program that was focused on agrobiodiversity conservation. And here by agrobiodiversity, I mean plants that are cultivated for agriculture, and they are native to Mexico. So that includes maize, beans, avocado, agave, and many other delicious plants that I hope you get to try in a new dish this week. So yeah, the objectives of CIAGRO, the previous one, please, la anterior. No, la siguiente. That one, thanks. So the objectives of CIAGRO are to generate and systematize open data on these native plants, but not just as a repository, because the priority is to mobilize this data to inform food security and conservation policies. Next. Siguiente. Yeah, so we have a lot of data in CIAGRO. We have everything from qualitative assessments on local markets and perceptions from local communities on their commerce and production practices. This is data that was collected in focus groups. But we also have information about nutrition, uses, tradition, and recipes just prepared with local ingredients. We have seed bank data, which is more typical data that is collected for agrobiodiversity. And I will be talking a lot more about field data collection and about new data that was collected specifically for this project. So Conavio funded 14 research groups from universities across the country. These were groups that had expertise in particular plant groups or in particular regions. And together they collected around 12,000 specimens and observations, collaborating really closely with local communities. And the work that we did at CIAGRO was coordinating all of these projects and also all the technical bits of data management. And the information that they collected was, again, like a combination of very typical data, which is biological data, like taxonomic names, habitat, also geographic data like coordinates. But because this is agrobiodiversity, they also collected social, cultural, and agronomic data. So really a lot of it. Siguiente. And 12,000 records doesn't sound like a lot. Even with 50 variables each, you can fit all of this in a spreadsheet. But the first insight that I want to share from data epistemologies is that big data is not just a lot of data. This is a definition that is moving beyond the physical attributes of data, like volume, and it instead highlights 3 characteristics of big data, which is the diversity. So this is diversity not only in terms of where data come from, but also diversity in terms of what they are intended to be used for. And all of this diversity enables integration across domains, methodologies, and communities. And the third aspect, which is to me one of the most interesting, is mobilization. Like big data within this understanding is data that is intended to be mobilized. And so going back to CIAGRO, I shared that mobilization is the priority for the system. Data are collected to inform policy and not as an afterthought. Like the main priority is not research and then maybe it goes into policy. No, the main objective is to inform policy. And so, yeah, siguiente, por favor. Yeah, so the aspect of mobilization to me is the most interesting because so many people are contributing to moving data from where they are created until they reach policy. And this makes even the understanding of what co-production means kind of a little hard to define. Yeah, like with so many roles, so many steps in between. And this takes me to the question of who are we co-producing with? So the second tool that I am gathering from data epistemologies are data journeys. Data journeys map how data move from where they are created until, through the different steps of cleaning, standardization, reuse, analysis, until they reach very different contexts. And so data journeys also emphasize the social aspects of data production. This means that we are able to see that the data production process, it really involves many different people. It's not just a technical process, but it's in fact like a conversation. And again, in CIAGRO, co-production is happening in a small scales and then in bigger scales. In a small scale, at the beginning of this journey, we have the research kind of groups who are the data collectors. And I highlight the role as a key intermediary between local donors because they are going into the field and talking to people, and then the rest of the system. So that's why they are acting like a bridge between the local knowledge, and they may in fact be part of those local communities. And then there's the bigger scale, which is how do we design workflows from collection to publication that integrate all of this diverse data and that make sure that they reach policy. And this bigger scale is more interesting to me because we are working at the system level. So it's an information system, and it's not just a research data set that will be used for one single publication. It is the integration of several data sets used at the national level to inform policy. So we really need to take a look at these bigger scales of co-production. And again, working with agrobiodiversity data, we're working with data that are literally rooted in place and in community, and then we're moving them beyond their context, very far away into policy. And this is a purpose that must stay relevant for local needs. So this aspect of how do we connect, how do we kind of keep a co-production focus throughout the data creation process, and not just at the beginning, like involving local donors, which is a necessary and almost a step that we take for granted. But we also need to look at the whole process. Siguiente, por favor. Yeah, so how do we make sure that people who are helping us collect this data are able to engage more meaningfully throughout all of this process? And the first thing that we did was develop a series of workshops on data literacy skills. We talked about data life cycles, data standards, FAIR principles, and ethical data use. It wasn't about programming, it wasn't about statistics, because what we wanted was to build a common ground and a common vocabulary with the community of data collectors. And if you look at the graph, that's the experience of data collectors before the workshop. And most of them did not have much experience with open data, and they also didn't have much experience with Creative Commons licenses. So that means that we were expecting people to ask for informed consent for gathering the data without them being able to explain what it means that everyone will be able to use their information for whatever purpose. And so after the workshops, we received feedback that there was more awareness of open data as a collective effort. Siguiente. And this was just a starting point. We also wanted to develop and to design community feedback processes for designing the tools in the system and the workflows. So it was not just having the workshops and for them learning new data vocabulary. It's also, okay, we're using this for you to help us design the workflows. And we did this through surveys, focus groups, and knowledge exchange spaces. And the difference was that before this experience, Conavio mostly only kind of communicated with PIs, who were the point of contact for data collector groups. And here we try to really reach students and technicians and everyone involved in the groups. And again, the feedback was that these spaces were really useful for reflection and for collaboration. Siguiente. And the last kind of example that I want to share is that beyond tool design, we also started conversations about data governance. This was in the form of how to design data management plans that kind of respected sensitive data. Sensitive in the sense that there was information about local donors. So how do we manage that? But also taxonomic data and donor preferences in terms of what information they want or not to share. And there was again like a negotiation and a balance between conservation concerns and data access and best practices versus exception to the rules. And agaves were a particularly tricky conversation because besides the conservation concerns, there are also commercial interests. But it was a good starting point, and it was more like a pilot program than a full data management kind of conversation. Siguiente. And so the question that I kind of want to end with is, how do we bridge this gap? On one side, you see one picture of the Agrobiodiversity Fair here in Oaxaca. It is one stand only, and look at that diversity. So on the other side, we see some numbers from our system. That's a screenshot. And what we want is that those numbers actually honor the diversity from that we see in agrobiodiversity. And we can only do this if we are kind of maintaining that co-production focus throughout the data generation process. And this is a quote that I like a lot, that is saying that just gathering the skills and tools from data science is not enough for knowledge production, because the critical issue is how to kind of merge the solutions with domain-specific knowledge that is embedded in a social context. And this is why I am still kind of trying to understand what co-production means in data-centric projects. Siguiente. And so thank you for listening. You can download the slides in the QR code. And yeah, there's a big team involved in the work that I shared today.
So our final presenter is here, and while she is catching her breath and uploading her presentation, if you'll allow me to make just a few observations. First of all, I am so happy. I feel like these presentations have been so wonderful, and I really appreciate everybody's work and effort and ideas. One of the things that I kind of see across the sessions and in a lot of these papers is that the presence of these settler colonial categories, things and tropes, courts, water conservation bills, extractive sites, wastelands, maps, are still very much alive and well in dispossessing people of resources, constraining the way people use land, shaping the way people use land. But you've also shown how people are very creatively maintaining really sustainable, biodiverse land uses despite this, and I think that's something that we always have to keep our eye on, right, is the way that people are still making and producing through their everyday practices and their farming practices really incredibly biodiverse landscapes that are tied to culture and other processes. And then finally, this has been one of my favorite conference sessions on methods ever. I think that the methods that you all have presented have been spectacular. So from board games to ecological plots, to art projects, to photo voice, to court case analysis, to the co-production of knowledge and flexible methodology with tribes. I mean, this is like amazing, beautiful work that's about privileging, engaging people in ways that aren't kind of this positivistic Western scientific way, and really bringing people's voices and their experiences and their desires for the future into the discussion of land and why it matters. So I just want to say, methodologically, this has been some of my favorite papers of any conference I have ever attended. So thank you so much. Those are my observations, but I would love to open it up if other people want to comment or question. sing karaoke. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was very interesting. I have a question for the presenter who presented on flexible methods. I want to put it positively. I think I'll just ask a very direct question. You mentioned that your research, your project was focusing on the current issues or the pressing issues of the tribal communities. So I'd like to know that by the end of the project or during the project, if you can give me some examples of the pressing issues and how they were solved for the people, if there's some examples.
Yeah, so a lot of the issues that we're looking at are like ongoing challenges that the tribes are trying to address. So for example, with the Karuk tribe, they're trying to reestablish their right to conduct cultural burning in a way that's not overseen by the federal government in this, highly controlled and patriarchal way. And that's a much broader conversation. And so a lot of what we're doing is working with them to then share that research in broader forums or share their policy strategies in many forums. So for example, I go talk to my policymakers or my senators, or I join them when we're talking to multiple senators. And I think together, along with a lot of other people, we're able to kind of elevate the voice about the need for policy change to respect tribal priorities in these contexts. So those are some of the main things. And then there are other things, like right now there's a lot of conversation on changing some of our burned area recovery programs. And when those conversations come up in policy together, we're able to communicate what some successful changes would look like. Our Congress is not particularly active at this moment, so I think it'll be an ongoing conversation for legislative sessions coming up. Yeah.
Okay, and our last presenter in these sessions is Dr. Andrea Bodin-Ferrar, who's from Colorado State University and is going to be presenting on incorporating local people and ecosystem services in Bolivia.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to collect my thoughts because I'm coming straight from the airport after 2 days of delayed flights. It's all good, I'm here. So please bear with me. This is why I'm wearing an airport t-shirt too. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about some work that I've been doing in Bolivia. I am from Bolivia and I've been working in the region for a long time. Let me just check if this works. Okay. So thank you to the session organizers and to everyone who's here. The previous presenters, I am so sorry I missed your talks. I was very much looking forward to that, but hopefully I will be able to catch up on the slides or the videos. As Heidi mentioned, my name is Andrea Bodin-Ferrar. I am assistant professor at Colorado State University. And in this talk, I will be sharing some thoughts and results from work that I have been conducting with colleagues from Stanford University and the University of Beni in Bolivia, since I was a postdoc with the Natural Capital Project. This work has been carried out under the umbrella of the Llanos de Mojos Working Group, a consortium of institutions committed to the conservation and sustainable development of the Llanos de Mojos region in Bolivia. And that group is led by the Wildlife Conservation Society and is funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And today I will be talking about a research project within that broad umbrella in which we aim to produce information on future development scenarios for the region to assess the potential impacts of those scenarios on ecosystem services, but ecosystem services that are prioritized by local actors, and through which we came to work with the concept of sistemas de aprovechamiento to better represent in our models the spaces in which decisions are made and in which impacts are felt. I have plenty of time to work on a script, so I'm gonna be reading it just to make sure that I stay on time. So sorry if it's not the most conducive, but it's helpful. So the Llanos de Mojos region, for those of you who are not familiar with them, you can see them on the map with the yellow boundaries. They're the biggest wetland complex in the Amazon basin, and it is a unique system composed of wetlands, savannas, and forests that roughly correspond to the Beni department in Bolivia. Water shapes this landscape and how people have interacted with it for millennia. Every year, massive parts of Mojos are flooded, and the duration of the seasonal floods is an important factor in defining ecosystems, but also the livelihood strategies that people have developed to live within these ecosystems and transform them as well. Savannas are in the central part of Mojos, and they are mostly dedicated to extensive cattle ranching, and the forests are in the margins, and they correspond to agroforestry and multiple forest use systems in indigenous territories that have been consolidated in the areas of quote-unquote lesser economic value. Throughout this landscape, we can find remnants of historic occupation and interactions with the biocultural landscape by various indigenous peoples, for example, in the form of forest islands or dense archaeological features. Today's landscape is the result of multiple waves of colonial and settler oppression, as well as indigenous resistance and reivindication of rights, including the indigenous marches that led to the recognition of indigenous territories in the 1990s. Currently, significant portions of the landscape are titled to 18 different indigenous groups, are designated as protected areas or as UNESCO Ramsar sites. But as many other regions in Latin America and beyond, Mojos is subject to mounting pressures from climate change and the intensification of extractive activities. In particular, the approval in 2019 of a new land use plan for Beni, which expands the areas approved for agriculture from almost zero to over 40% of the department, and it has generated a lot of concern among indigenous communities in particular. In this context, our project aimed to generate information for local actors and decision makers on the potential impacts of the new land use plan on ecosystem services prioritized by them. And for that, we first conducted workshops with municipal authorities, cattle ranchers, representatives of indigenous organizations, peasant organizations, fisher people associations, to elicit information on their conceptions of ecosystem services contributions to their well-being. We didn't really use the concept of ecosystem services, but we elicited that sort of relationships, the current balance and recent trends on the provision of those ecosystem services. So are they satisfying demand or not? What has been the recent trend, for example, in water provision or pollination or biodiversity, etc., soil fertility, and their aspirations for the future of their territories. Then we integrated that information, and we conducted 71 workshops across the 19 municipalities of Beni. So it was kind of a massive effort that required a big team of people. Then we integrated that information in land use systems transition models for 3 different scenarios. And then we assessed the impacts of each scenario on the prioritized ecosystem services and indicators. The 3 scenarios that we constructed based on the workshops reflect a spectrum. Whoops. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Let's just go there. The 3 scenarios that we constructed based on the workshops reflect a spectrum of visions for the future that imply different degrees of landscape transformation. A business as usual scenario in which the expansion of the agricultural frontier continues at the current rate, an accelerated scenario that would closely mirror the implementation of the new land use plan in the next 25 years, and a scenario based on the conservation of the biocultural landscape through activities such as sustainable cattle ranching or agroforestry, among others. While trying to model those potential transitions, we realized that our land cover baseline was not informative enough, and we needed to integrate the who in the landscape. For a given cover category like crops or forests or savannas, who owns the land and makes decisions about the land has implications in terms of the use and management of those lands, as you know. So we combined cover and land tenure. cover and land tenure information, as well as information on protected areas, forest concessions, and forest management plans to make assumptions about use, broadly defined, and establish a baseline for our scenarios at the scale of Llanos de Mojos. That is how we came up with a map of what we called sistemas de aprovechamiento, which we have only been able to translate to land use systems in English, and we can talk more about that because I am not satisfied with that translation. These systems include things like multiple use in savannas located in indigenous territories with low density grazing and hunting, but also several different types of agriculture and forest use, and all of it very much depending on who is present in those areas. We define sistemas de aprovechamiento as subunits within a biocultural landscape which describe the occupation forms of the territory resulting from complex historical, socioeconomic, demographic, environmental, and political trajectories. And as I've been thinking about it, the difference between this concept and land systems might be one of scale and of actor specificity, but I am open to critique and conversation around those boundaries, if any. Maybe we're talking about something that has already been conceptualized. From that baseline, for every 50 hectare pixel, we calculated probabilities of transition or not to other land use systems by considering the pixel's elevation, closeness to roads, protected areas, Ramsar sites, and archaeological sites, and more importantly, or also as importantly, the type of property and the development priorities of municipal governments that we derived from the workshops and from our conversations with people. We obtained 3 different future maps of the region. In the business as usual and accelerated scenario, not surprisingly, mechanized agriculture dominates savannas, while forested areas are massively cleared for small-scale farming and ranching. In the called eco scenario, the main transition is from traditional extensive ranching to sustainable ranching, which, for example, includes less use of fire and pasture rotation. I don't have included a legend because it would be a little busy, but red is where mechanized agriculture would expand, so you can see the contrast between the scenarios. And then we use those scenarios to assess trade-offs for ecosystem services that actors deem relevant and that can be summarized by, on the one hand, short-term economic gains that are concentrated in private lands with losses in water quantity, water quality, crop diversity, and income from non-timber forest products, and equality in income distribution. While in the eco scenarios, we have very modest gains from agriculture and ranching, not surprisingly, but greater preservation of water resources. I'm finishing, I made it really quick. Water resources, crop diversity, and diversified livelihoods. And I did not get into all the details of the methodology, of course, because there's no time, but we also modeled the effects of climate change in these scenarios, and what we see is that no matter what development pathways people might take, climate change is going to have an impact on water resources, but the added transformation and the expansion of mechanized agriculture would significantly intensify those losses in water quantity and also quality, given the extensive use of fertilizers and pesticides. So we put this information in front of stakeholders for a second round of workshops and see what they thought about the scenarios. And what we gathered from it is that people are really struggling with choosing one pathway because we want everything at the same time in the same place. And I think just the process of having that information elicited and on the table for discussion is interesting. And just in terms of some of the contributions and limitations of this work that is still ongoing, and we are refining our results, the combination of empirical actor-generated data with spatial modeling allows the construction of context-specific scenarios that in turn allows us to ask actor-specific questions, for example, the impact of transformation on specific groups, or the distribution of burdens and benefits across actors. They also allow for consideration of transformation across all vegetation classes and not only forests that have been very much the center of the scenarios that exist for transformations in the region. But on the other hand, it is very time and resources intensive, especially for a large area as Mojos, and it can be difficult to apply at larger scales. Information on tenure can also be very elusive. We got this information through unofficial channels, and we were lucky to have it, but it's oftentimes something that is not readily accessible. And maybe one of the biggest limitations is that, at least so far, we have considered tenure as static, and we know that it can be very dynamic. Thus, in terms of future research, we are currently expanding the application of these models in Mojos to include other ecosystem services and processes like habitat connectivity and changes in income from fisheries, so making the link between terrestrial and aquatic systems. We're developing scenarios that include some degree of dynamism in tenure arrangements, at least in terms of the possibilities of people leasing their land to external stakeholders for mechanized agriculture production, and the implications of that in terms of income distribution and what happens when capitals leave the region. And yeah, that's what we're trying to do, and I will be very curious to hear your questions. And sorry, I missed the previous session, so I'm not able to integrate this too much with what was said before, but yeah, I hope we can connect further in the conference. Thank you so much.
So we have 2 minutes if people have questions for Andrea or comments or questions for other folks.
Andrea, this is a really interesting talk, and your struggle over sistemas de aprovechamiento. I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a new paper earlier this year that's called an actor-centered scalable land system typology for addressing biodiversity loss in the world's tropical dry woodlands, which is a very long title and an even longer author list, but a couple of the authors are here at this meeting, and they seem to be struggling with a very similar thing and their main case study is in the Chaco, which is not the same, but nearby. So it might be something to look at, and you might be able to catch some of those people.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. My question is very specific. How do you actually implement the ecosystem services approach in this specific territory? I mean, do you actually implement it? I mean, is the community able to use these ecosystem services as in any way regarding the conservation of the land or whatever? That was my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So that is a very good question. So what for, right? What we have been trying to do with the umbrella of the Llanos de Mojos working group, who are in the region and who have relationships with stakeholders at different levels, so from municipal to regional governments, but also indigenous organizations, and to a lesser degree, cattle ranchers associations, some a subset of cattle ranchers that are more open to these kinds of discussions. They have been working on environmental management plans for certain municipalities and for the whole region of Beni, and trying to use this information for example, zoning within municipalities or selecting sites that are particularly important for water, humedales, and the like. It's, I would say, to some degree participatory. I would not say it's a bottom-up approach. That is something that we have struggled with too in the project, given that we're engaging with such a variety of stakeholders at a scale that, at least for me, is uncomfortable because it's quite big. But we are supporting at least some policy efforts, and some capacity building efforts within local governments, and they have plans to. They have a program, or we have a program that is going to continue for at least 10 years. So we're hoping that these are just building blocks of information that are going to be part of a longer process of building capacity around making visible the contributions of certain systems like savannas and wetlands to well-being that are, at least in the new land use plan, considered just areas open for, like, why haven't we used this before, for agriculture? Forests have certain provisions in the new land use plan, but savannas are just considered valueless, I guess, in terms of ecosystem services. So that is one of the things that we've been trying to make visible.
We are at time, and I think people might need a break before the next session. So if you have a question or comment for someone, just grab them. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks again to all our presenters.